Hello and welcome to the ManageIQ Sprint 166 review. This was a standard 2-week sprint. So as usual, I will provide the overview. Kavya will update us on the UI, Adam on the providers, and Jason on the platform, the API, and the developer experience. All right, so first and foremost, would like to announce new releases of ManageIQ. So Losker is now GA. You can read about all the details in the announcement in that link. Also, Kasparov and Jansa got new updates, and you can read about the things that went into it there. One of them was to address a CVE that we found. And we're currently working on the Morphe release, and if you want to see what's going on there, check out the roadmap. There's a link there for that, and you'll see how we're doing and what's happening in that spot. All right, so this sprint, we nudged up over the number of pull requests merged, the most since sprint 159, so that's a great sign. And pull requests open stayed steady at about 120. So that's great. And slowly the total PRs still open is, I would say it's also holding steady. So I'm assuming there's kind of a lot of either old PRs or something that probably need to be cleaned out at some point. As to the breakdown of the pull requests merged, 32 in this sprint, 32 were bugs, 50 were enhancements, 12 were refactorings, and the rest were sprinkled around. And with that, I will turn it over to Kavya.
Yep. Thanks, Oleg. Good afternoon, everyone. This sprint total 12 PRs got merged into UI repo. Out of 12, 8 are bugs, 1 enhancement, and so on. These are like some of the important PRs from that list. I'll say more on these in later slides. Next slide, please. So this is about selecting multiple rows across the pages in table. For example, before this PR, let's say I want to compare a bunch of hosts in host table. I select few rows in my first page and go to second page by clicking forward button in the pagination. And so, and if I come back to the first page, selections made in the first page are gone. So that is fixed in this issue. So Melody added a cool video in the PR, so I thought of just adding it here. Yeah, so if you notice, the selections are still there once you go back, flip between the pages. So next slide, please. In this PR, sorry. Yeah.
Here we go.
Yep. Yeah, in this PR, there were a lot of console errors in many of the forms. So these are not really affecting any functionality, but these are just popping up in the console and looking really bad. Gilbert fixed them as many as errors he could find. Next slide, please. This is a fix in actions page. For Ansible playbook action in summary page, it's not showing complete data. It's just showing the name and that's it. Whereas for other actions, it is showing full data. So Mengshi noticed that and fixed it. Next slide, please. Oh no, something is missed. Yeah. So this is for Ansible template summary page. If it's a configuration workflow type, summary page is broken and Melody fixed that here. Next slide, please. Yep. This is an enhancement done for the VMs table. Few months ago, when we removed grid view for the tables, we lost some of the display information with it, like operating system here. One of the community user noticed that and pointed it. So in this PR, OS column got added, and for the power state icon, background is added for the icon so that we can easily tell on and off state here. I think that's all from UI. With that, over to Adam.
Thanks, Kavya. So in core this sprint, we renamed the flavor CPU attributes to match the equivalent ones in hardware. They were slightly different. There was some confusion about what they actually meant. So this makes them more explicit and also makes it match what people are usually familiar with in the hardware table which is used for both VMs and hosts. So the old CPUs column is renamed CPU total cores. Typically for most cloud providers, this is the only one that's ever set. There are only a few that actually expose the CPU socket topology, and that's where it got a little bit confusing, where different providers were setting different attributes. So for providers which do expose the sockets and cores per socket, then they would set the CPU cores per socket, and also we added a new column for CPU sockets. So this again just matches what you normally see on a VM or a host. We also added aliases for backwards compatibility for this. Keenan also continued his effort of running workers as non-root. So for this one, all of the provider workers were moved over. Last sprint, he moved over all the core workers. This one, he knocked out all the provider workers, which is awesome. Next slide. For auto SDE, they added form parameters for the create cloud volume operation. The method was there, so it could be called directly, but there was no way to expose it to the UI previously. So this sprint, they added those parameters so that it gets picked up by the UI and you can actually create the cloud volume through the UI right now, which is great. Next slide. For VPC, this was basically just knocking out a lot of operations for some of the other cloud volumes and networks. So Nasser created the ability to create cloud volumes and delete cloud volumes, create cloud networks. Right now, you can only call that directly. You can't create it through the UI. Hopefully next sprint, we'll get that exposed. And also the ability to create cloud subnets. So really a great swath of operations for all the associated inventory that the VPC provider can create. We also fixed a refresh exception when an instance's image returns 404. This typically happens if it's a very old if it's a very old instance and the image that it was created from is no longer available. This is causing a refresh failure, and now we just say it's nil and move on. For the Power Virtual Servers cloud provider, we're now dynamically collecting the cloud volume types. Previously, these were exposed through configuration, so you could add a new one. But obviously, it's even better to just pull them directly from the API, which is what we're doing now. We also fixed an issue with the CPU type not being set when you provisioned a VM from a stock image. This was not able to be determined from the operating system type. So Jay had to go and pull this information from a different place. So now we're setting the CPU type properly. Next slide. For VMware, so the version 6.0 has been the minimum required for a while, but we weren't actually enforcing this. So now we actually, when we verify the authentication credentials are valid, we also check the minimum version. This is important because as VMware adds features, we have to continually add checks on the version to see if we can use a certain feature or not. So coming up in the next sprint, we'll be able to drop a lot of logic on if any of the versions less than 6.0, we'll just be able to drop all that old conditional code, which is nice for cleanup purposes. We also
and VMware no longer supports 5.x, right? That's the
reason. Oh yeah. So yeah, 5.5 is out of technical guidance as of September 2020. Actually, I just answered this for someone else, so didn't just have that off the top of my head. Yeah, so we only support versions of vSphere that VMware supports, and so we'll maintain this as that goes along. We also added support for changing the port. Previously, this was hard coded to 443, which 99% of vSpheres in production are on 443. But for development, the VC simulator is on port 8989, and so it's really nice to be able to go in and change the port without having to run the simulator as root. Especially if for a developer laptop, if it's issued, you might not have root access sometimes. So just nice to be able to switch that out. Next slide. Oh yeah, and this is what the new form looks like to be able to set the port. So this is a case where you might be running the Go VC simulator on localhost with the default port. And I think that's it for providers. Over to Jason.
On the platform side, Nick Lamoro changed the way MIQ sets works. Previously, it was using the relationships table, but sets are really a degenerate form of tree, and that wasn't necessary and created a lot of overhead, especially in querying. So this reworks it to no longer use that table and actually unlocks some performance possibilities there. Keenan, as Adam said, changed the workers, the provider workers, to use Manage IQ, to use the Manage IQ user, and that's part of his continuing effort to use less root on the appliance. Adam fixed an issue where the STI loader would be written in production. It's not so much an issue, but in the move to getting rid of root, we found that there were cases where the STI loader was being written. He also found some issues in there that he fixed, so that even if there weren't changes, it would still not write it in production. Brandon is working further on allowing us to use SSL certs between our pods. So these are some continuing changes along that effort. And finally, I added some changes to get our appliances to use CentOS Stream, and that was merged this sprint. On the bug side, the Postgres secret labeling and the internal host name were fixed by Brandon. These are just some bugs that he found as part of the SSL work, and he got those cleaned up. And finally, he fixed a bug where an extra dot in the RPM release number was causing version number comparison to not work as expected. And so our builds were not getting the most recent RPMs for nightlies. So this fixed that problem, and now the nightly builds should have the most recent RPM from that night. Next slide, please. On the API side, Nick fixed an issue with the filter expression save format. In particular, MIQ expressions would come in and not get serialized properly, and this PR fixed that up. Next slide, please. And finally, on the developer side, Joe added more changes to support local logical replication. So if you want to set up a development machine with logical replication, this is now fully working. He has a coming PR for the next sprint to add rig tasks to make that even easier for developers. And finally, I fixed a small little issue with presentation of tables using the tableize method from more core extensions, where if you had a field that was colored in, but it was smaller than the width of the column, it would shrink the width of that specific line, and that's fixed now. And that's it.
All right, and with that, sprint 166 comes to an end. Next sprint is 167, and we'll meet again on August 4th, same time, same Zoom. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for their contributions, the whole community. I'd like to thank the speakers for preparing the slides and presenting, and see you next time. Thanks a lot, everyone.